Well, I must say this must have been the longest last point I've ever Well, it's truly an honor for me to be here today and to be sitting on stage with Professor Wu. It's rather unusual for me because usually I would be on the other side. I would be listening to your speech and taking pictures.
Don't tease me.
But no, truly, it is an honor to be here today. I would thank you all for coming. I would certainly thank Jinru and others for making this possible. I'm going to start with a bit of background, I guess, to explain why someone like me would become so involved in what is going on in Taiwan. I moved to Taiwan 9 years ago after working for Canadian government and thinking that I would be only there for a few years, do the Western person thing, go there, learn a bit of Mandarin, discover Asia, and then move on and go somewhere else. Go back to Canada, maybe go to the United States, go to Japan, but there was no long-term plan when I first moved there. As I said, I've been here 9 years, so the plans changed. Really because for some reason I truly found myself in Taiwan. I oftentimes hear of people who go to Israel and they have this epiphany, they have this something shifts inside of them and they discover something that's quasi-religious. Well, I had a similar experience in Taiwan. I don't know why that is. It could be because I am originally from Quebec, which also has its own identity issues. It has its own separatist movement. That was years ago a lot more radical than anything we have actually seen in Taiwan. The only major difference, well, two major differences. One, Canada is already a federalist system, and it's an extraordinarily efficient one, and it's pretty just as well. And the other thing is Ottawa is not aiming 1,600 missiles at Quebec. So the analogy is a false one, but there are some parallels as well. So ironically, I do support Taidu. I do not support Quebec independence. So we can discuss that later on. So I became a journalist after 6 months arriving in Taiwan, was hired initially as a copy editor at the Taipei Times, which remains to this day probably the most prominent English language newspaper for Taiwan. Then gradually became a journalist, editorial writer, deputy news editor, and all that. It was, for the most part, an enjoyable experience. It allowed me to learn a lot about Taiwan. Back then I focused mostly on military affairs because I did believe that was the single most important story when it comes to Taiwan, especially the security relationship with the United States. So I wrote about arms sales, I wrote about submarines, I wrote about the F-16s that never materialized, and all these things. And over time, I felt I needed to move on to greater things. The Taipei Times remained a fairly limited publication, somewhat very conservative in its take on politics and all that. So I felt I had gained enough experience and it was time for me to be hired. Sorry, I'm being attacked by mosquitoes. It's a Kung Fei mosquito. Sorry. I still read about military affairs.
You just cannot pass it.
But unfortunately, it happened at a time when international media are pulling out of Taiwan. They keep saying that this is for financial reasons, and that is very true. It is a problem for traditional media, and they will start by cutting into countries that they don't see as being as important as other countries. So they're all sending all the media are sending reporters full-time to China. Some of them go to Japan, some of them go to South Korea, because this is where the action is. But unfortunately, Taiwan has oftentimes been the first country, at least in Asia, where they will slash positions, or they will not hire, or if someone resigns or is transferred to a different country, they will not replace them. So what that meant for someone like me is that there were no opportunities for career progression. I was at the Taipei Times for 7 years and a half in all, and individuals who actually helped found the newspaper. When I told them I was with Taipei Times for 7 years and a half, they're like, like, really, 7 years and a half? How could you do it? And I said, well, I wanted to do something else, but unfortunately there were no opportunities. So what this eventually meant is that late last year, my Taiwanese wife and I decided that maybe it was time for us to leave Taiwan. And we started actively looking for employment in Washington, D.C. We were looking at think tanks and all that. I was packing very reluctantly. I cried most of the time that I was packing because I did not want to leave Taiwan. But I felt that this was the right thing to do, at least in terms of my career. And I tried to convince myself, and my wife tried to convince herself that this was the right thing to do. Early January, Dr. Taiwan's Thinking Taiwan Foundation invited my wife to go give a 2-hour presentation about her experiences in Taiwan. And she's like, well, Michael's been there for 8 years and a half as a journalist. I'm pretty sure he has a few things to say as well. Would you mind if you joined me at the presentation? So they said yes. I obviously said yes, and I'm like, I have nothing to lose. There were board members, Taiwan was there. Some people were missing because at the time they were traveling to China. But I said, I'm going to be very, very frank. I'm going to be very honest. I'm going to tell the way I see things. I observed the 2012 presidential election very closely and saw a number of things that the Green Camp did that I thought were self-defeating. And I'm like, I have absolutely nothing to lose. I'm going to be very honest to Taiwan and tell her where I think she went wrong and her advisors went wrong. She's nodding, she's taking notes, and nobody's throwing objects at me, so I'm like, okay, we're doing well. So after 2 hours, she says, okay, we're done, so people in the room can leave, but she points at my wife and me, she's like, you're coming to my office. So, you don't say no to Taiwan. She's very, very bossy. So she says, don't quote me.
It's on the tape, don't worry.
It's on tape, okay. I need to find a new job again. So she sits us down and she's like, oh, so I hear you're moving to the United States. And I'm like, yeah, we're trying to. So do you have jobs waiting for you in the United States? I'm like, well, we're looking and all that. So she leans over and she has this cute British accent and she's like, don't go. So I'm like, what do you mean don't go? And she's like, she becomes a little more serious and she says, the next 2 years in Taiwan are going to be extraordinarily important. And we cannot afford at this time to lose individuals who not only care about the place, but understand it as well. And have the ability to communicate what is going on here with the rest of the international community. Part of the presentation that I had made focused on what I just said, the fact that international media are no longer paying attention to Taiwan, or very few of them are, or they have good reporters, but the reporters are based in Beijing, and they're reporting on what's going on in Taiwan, which makes exactly no sense, right? So she's like, go home, did you get it? So she's like, go home, think about it, make me a proposal, and then we'll talk about it. So basically the proposal was that we would create this new English language platform that would try to address or fill that void in reporting and opinion making about Taiwan. So we launched it 2 weeks ago. It was delayed twice. It was delayed twice because of you guys occupying the legislature. But we eventually launched, and this is ultimately what keeps me and my wife in Taiwan to continue doing the work that we believe is very important for this place. Interestingly, Jinru said earlier that I have been to every single protest in Taiwan. Well, almost every single protest. But the interesting thing is that I started paying attention to civil society in Taiwan about 2 years ago because I realized over time that the narrative of Taiwan as a security partner of the United States and a client for purchases of U.S. defense articles might not be the most important story about Taiwan nowadays and for the coming years. And once I started paying attention to social movements in Taiwan, I realized that for the next few years, the real story coming out of the island is going to be internal stability, and it will be mobilization and conflict with not only China, but also conflict with the government and agencies that time and time again have been failing their democratic mandate. So every time I went to protest, I started seeing some individuals that are not very well known. First time I saw Ted Waiting, we were on Jinan Lu, and he was giving a speech. He was losing his voice because he had been screaming for a while, and unfortunately he smokes as well, it doesn't help. But I saw this guy, I was completely blown away. And I went back home and I wrote an opinion piece. That was during the anti-media monopoly protest. And I went home, I wrote an article for Wall Street Journal, and I said, watch for this guy, he's a future leader. And that was in December 2012. Lin Feifan was there as well. I think he has matured a fair bit in the past 2 years. He still looked like this scrawny little kid back then, but also very impressive. I saw that he was a power behind the scenes as well. So I sensed tremendous talent, tremendous dedication, and it made me realize that the narrative out there that young Taiwanese would not fight, that they have given up, that they don't care, that they're too involved in their materialistic lives as long as they have the latest iPhone and they can buy their latte at Starbucks, they're going to be happy. And I realized that there's a segment of Taiwanese society that actually will take action when necessary. So I'm like, okay, we started with media monopoly, then we went to Dapu, then we went to Yuanlin, and then we went to Huaguang, and then we went to Shilin, Wangjia, and then we went to Leshan Sanatorium, then we went to Taoyuan, and then we went to protests against the government where they were throwing shoes at government officials. So we ended up in Taichung, and I get hit by shoes. So more and more I felt that it was necessary for me to get to know these individuals and actually write about what was going on. Then I had a brick wall because nobody was interested again. Even I was still with the Taipei Times back then, and my managers were like, this is unimportant, this is not newsworthy, and foreign audiences are not interested. I'm like, what do you mean they're not interested? They're like, there's no bloodshed, nobody's being killed. And I mean, you try to sell those articles to newspapers, South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, for example, and it's the same thing. They said, very interesting, but we're not interested because, you look north, there's people being killed, locked away by the hundreds, and then North Korea is building nuclear weapons, and then the Philippines are flooding, and hundreds of people are dying, blah, blah, blah. Taiwan is too quiet, it's not dramatic enough, right? I said, well, okay, I'm sorry if Taiwan is more advanced in many ways, but it doesn't mean it's uninteresting, right? So most of my writing over the past 2 years on those issues, ironically, had to be on my blog, or the blog of universities to which I'm attached. And it doesn't get a lot of exposure, but it still gets the story out there. And it gets picked up by other media, they translate some parts into Chinese, and you start building a name as someone who pays attention to those issues. But what I have been trying to do over the years, and I think we're going to try even more with the new platform, is to explain just how extraordinarily complex Taiwan is. It's fascinating in so many aspects. You do Aboriginal studies. There's, 14 tribes in Taiwan? You do colonial studies, post-colonial studies, ethnic issues, identity issues, security issues. Taiwan is part of the first island chain that keeps China bottled in, and so it cannot go out into the West Pacific and threaten other countries. There's every single issue, linguistics, history. I mean, it's a fascinating place, but people really don't get it. They don't pay attention to what's going on in Taiwan. It's subsumed into China studies in most university programs. It is not an entity or a subject in and of itself. And this needs to be corrected, and this is one of the things that I believe is my mandate. And people oftentimes say, oh, well, okay, I listened to your discourse on Taiwan and what I'm just saying now. How come, this is so admirable. You care more about Taiwan than most Taiwanese. Why is that? I think this is bogus. I don't think I care about Taiwan more than other people. But I do believe that as a human being, those are issues that everybody should stand up for. Whether I'm in Taiwan or not, whether I'm Taiwanese or not, is pointless. We're talking about values. I have liberal, fairly leftist values as a Canadian, and there's a lot of parallels with what I see in Taiwan. And it would be an extraordinary loss for the entire international community if a unique sovereignty like Taiwan were to disappear or its quality be gradually eroded by an authoritarian regime that doesn't recognize it. So it's our responsibility as human beings to tell that story. And I had the chance to have been there physically for a while and to have been exposed to different aspects of that society. So I have, in a way, the ability, but also the responsibility to communicate that with the rest of the world, right? So, so this is what we're doing. And then came the sunflower movement. Well, before I move on to the sunflower movement, I have to talk about my wedding. You'll see why. Some of you probably know my wife, Katie Chen. She is from Dallas, Texas. She grew up in Plano and then went back to Taiwan 2 years ago. And we decided we would get married and then, and then we would get married and then we would move to the United States. And the interesting thing is that both she and I have been following social movements in Taiwan for about 2 years and a half. And we were like sitting down and, okay, so who do we invite for our wedding? And her family is in Taiwan, but some of them are here in the US. And it turns out that about half of the guests at our wedding 2 months later would be sitting inside the Liefhagen. Which says a lot. And there are actually videos of our wedding on YouTube, and Kenny rapped with Fishlin and Little J. They were our musicians for our wedding. Fishlin and Little J were inside the legislature as well. And we had pretty much all the towels from Social Revolt to Land Justice and they're all at the wedding and they're being flashed. And the irony is that a lot of our father's friends happen to be former KMT legislators or so some of them did not get up to dance with us. They sat down, ate their food, and pretended that they were somewhere else. It was quite interesting. And actually, Lin Feifan himself was invited to our wedding. I ran into him with journalist Ed Zoll, who was a PTS at a bar near NTU, and I said, Feifan, sit down, and you're coming to our wedding. Well, oh, yeah, I promise I'm going to the wedding. My girlfriend can't make it, but I'll be there. So day of our wedding, evidently Feifan doesn't show up, and we found out he had a legitimate reason because they were actually down in Taito holding information sessions about the cross-strait services trade agreement. So he gets a pass. He had a very good reason for missing our wedding. And then, about 2 months later, the occupation started. And as someone who followed those social movements over the past 2 years, again, as Professor Wu was mentioning earlier, it did not come out of nowhere. It was not a spontaneous outburst of irrational anger by young Taiwanese. This is something that had been building up over the years. So a lot of people were surprised, and when they asked me, what's your reaction to the occupation? I keep telling them, based on what I experienced in the past 2 years and how the government was reacting to their demands and their actions, I'm not surprised. It was almost inevitable that they would do something like this. And they're like, inevitable? They would invade the legislature and then the executive yuan? Well, executive yuan is something else. Maybe that was inevitable. But I said, you realize that there's a precedent for this. They already occupied the Ministry of the Interior on August 18 last year. And they occupied it for 24 hours. They just did not go inside the building. And most people were not aware of that. This was news to them, right? And I said, well, if you had been paying attention over in recent months, there was anger building because a number of cases of injustice that they were mobilizing over were completely ignored by the government. I said, do you remember early this year, there's this guy who very early in the morning jumped into a truck, 35-ton truck, and drove it right up the steps of the presidential office. Okay, you listen to reporting in the media and what the presidential office said, oh, disgruntled former husband who had lost a case of domestic abuse with his wife. I said, read the notes that he posted on his Facebook page the day before. He names every single case, including Napu, of injustice caused by the government in the past 2 years. And he says, I am the little man, I was screwed by the government, and there's a bunch of other little men and little women who are being screwed. I'm taking action. Again, if people were paying attention, they would have seen it coming, but they didn't, right? And they refused to see it because ultimately it was inconvenient. Because the discourse both in Taiwan and overseas, and especially in this country, is that everything is fine across the Taiwan Strait. And this is what we want because it lowers the risks of war. And the United States is too busy with Afghanistan, it's too busy with Iraq. We do not want to have to send soldiers to defend Taiwan. So we would rather pretend that everything is fine. 6 years of rapprochement, what is it now, 1921 cross-strait agreements. It's fine, so Taiwanese must be okay with it because they're not making noise. They are making noise, they're not listening. And the DPP is completely neutralized. It's incapable of countering those agreements or policies by the government. So eventually, it was social movements that had to take action. And over and over and over again, they said, we have to do it because the opposition party, for some reason, is not doing it. And oftentimes they would tell me, well, Michael, we kind of consider you Taiwanese, but you're still Canadian. You have that magical passport. If the S hits the fan, you can leave. You can take a plane and go back home. This is our home. We don't have another passport, right? And I certainly don't want to be Chinese. And I don't want my way of life to change. We don't want to see what's happening in Hong Kong right now being replicated in our country. So we have to fight for this. And I heard this over and over and over again. So I'm like, okay, we're onto something here. That claim that Taiwanese will never fight, that they would abandon, that the first bullet fired in anger in their direction, I think it's bullshit. They would take action, especially. And as I was saying last night, the threat is no longer abstract. They grew up a lot of them were probably 3 or 4 years old when China fired missiles. It was bracketing Taiwan in 1995, 1996. They were too young. I mean, a lot of them, I talk about the first Gulf War, and they don't even know what I'm talking about. They weren't born, right? But now they are starting to see the repercussions of closer ties with China and how their illiberal way of life is starting to affect the very foundations of what makes Taiwan unique. And they have seen, I think it was very sad, but at the same time an extraordinary learning experience for young Taiwanese to go to Huaguang, young Taiwanese to fight over demolitions in Dapu, and you see actual buildings being demolished and entire lives being destroyed, and the memories and pharmacies that people built over the years. And in some cases that led to the death of some individuals, Mr. Zhang in Dapu, for example. There were a number of individuals who died in Huaguang. And it was extraordinary to see this civic mindedness, those values that became a form of nationalism. You had second generation, third generation Western fighting alongside very, very Taiwanese young people from Tainan. Lin Feifan himself being from Tainan. Lin Feifan got into trouble with the authorities and was dragged by the police fighting over the house of Jiang Beibei. I went into Jiang Beibei's house. He came to Taiwan over with the Kuomintang in 1949. His entire house was a shrine to Chiang Kai-shek. His entire life he voted KMT. And then you have these young Taiwanese who are like, I don't care. I don't care if he voted for Chiang Kai-shek and he has a shrine to Chiang Kai-shek. As far as I know, he is a citizen of this country and he identifies with this land now. Jiang Beibei tried to go back to China to rebuild his life with his two other brothers who stayed back. He lasted 2 months and he came back and he's like, I can't live there. Right? So it was extraordinary to see those young people. And I have to be careful when I say young because one IE berated me yesterday. I do not, when I talk about young, I don't talk in terms of age. It's one's ability to be young at heart and young at mind, and to be able to revisit your assumptions and change your ways when the situation calls for it. And it's extraordinary. Thanks to Gino's brother, CP, last year I had the extraordinary experience of attending Su Ming's 96th birthday. And we went to this Japanese restaurant near the red light district on Vincent Beilu. And again, to listen to him talking about how he loves to engage young people and how he still swims every morning and goes out to the protests. And I mean, the guy nearly dragged me under the table. It's extraordinary. It was Gambei after Gambei after Gambei. He's 96 years old. I'm 39. So this is what I mean by when I mean old versus young. I really don't want people to think that I'm talking about age in terms of physical age. And I do believe that there's a lot of young Taiwanese in Taiwan who are old, but there's also old Taiwanese in Taiwan who are young. And those are the people that we need to try to work with as well. And this is to the detriment of the DPP right now, that unfortunately there's a lot of dinosaurs in there. And this is a term that I used last night, and this is a term that I've used repeatedly in articles, and I got attacked by a lot of people for saying these things. But I think Taiwan faces such a challenge right now that sometimes we can't always be polite. We need to say things the way they really are. I'm not necessarily right in everything that I claim, but at least we're checking things, right? And this is why I've always really enjoyed your speeches as well, because you're out there and you say, yeah, hell, you use bad words, right? But it's okay. It's okay. Things to me, if we remain polite, if we're always too diplomatic, China will win. Taiwan needs to be heard. And sometimes it needs to do some things that are a little bit out of the ordinary, and occupying the legislature was such an experiment. It got, for the most part, well received. It generated a lot of positive publicity. In some circles, it was regarded rather negatively, especially among US officials and academics, whose definition of democracy, I believe, is too narrow. Democracy is a whole lot more than showing up for regular elections. But so many times people would email me or call me and they're like, but Mr. Cole, Taiwan's a democracy. How come they voted for these officials? If they're not happy, well, 2 years from now or 4 years from now, they can vote them out of office. And I said, but they can't afford to wait 2 years because the people that they elected broke their goddamn promises. So they have to take action, and they're not killing people. They're not Al-Qaeda, like some people in the Kuomintang claimed a few months ago at the height of the Sunflower movement. And I was so angry because my former job in Canadian intelligence, I was targeting Al-Qaeda and Lebanese Hezbollah, and I put pictures on my blog of what Al-Qaeda does to people. And then I put pictures of what sunflower people do to people. And they're sitting down on the ground, in hell, they're holding sunflowers. They're not rocket launchers, right? So, but there's a lot of educating. We really need, in each and every way, using our abilities, we need to truly explain to those people what the realities are in Taiwan. Not everything is perfect, but the actions that the people are taking are fully legitimate. There are situations when people need to go beyond the ordinary course of life and take action. And this has given me extraordinary hope. I used the word resilience yesterday. I have been using the word resilience for several months now, and my sense that Taiwan is a lot more resilient than people think comes from those social movements, and little by little their ability to bring other groups on board. Now I'm hearing a lot of people say, I voted Kuomintang all my life. I promise you next elections I will not vote for them. I said, does that mean you're going to vote for Minjin? He said, no. Don't go that far. But I'm not going to go for KMT, right? So I said, okay, as long as you don't vote for Zhang Anle's Unification Party. But one vote less for the KMT might still be favorable to other parties that take Taiwan a little more seriously. Another benefit of the Sunflower movement, I'm convinced, is that it has forced people within the Kuomintang to pay a little more attention to the demands of the public, because they got away with it for several years, but now they realize that they are crossing lines that people will not let them cross anymore. There has been an awakening. And it does not come out of nowhere, because the first time I experienced that firsthand was during Chen Yulin's visit to Taiwan in November 2008, and thousands of people mobilized again, and they called me to those little secret meetings, and already they were telling me, oh, we think we're being monitored by the police, so we have to meet secretly and all that. And already we sensed that fear, that paranoia, that sense of the unknown, and of course 10,000 police were mobilized during those 2 or 3 days, so it was a major event. It gave me hope, but they went away pretty fast. So I was like, okay, does that mean that Taiwanese are not capable of engaging in sustained opposition to the government. And then starting 2-3 years ago, when I started following the new movements, I realized that no, they are here to stay this time around. And it's not the large protests that we are used to seeing. The DPP organize very large protests. They bus people from around the country. They spend 2 or 3 hours on Tagalan Boulevard, and then they go home and that's it. And very conveniently ignored by the government, which doesn't change its policies. With this, the Miaoli self-help organizations, with the Alliance Against Home Demolitions, Alliance Against Media Monopoly, Black Island Youth Alliance, and Sunflower Movement, they engage in what I like to call guerrilla protests. And as you said, you know, very flash mobs and all that, keeping the government on their toes, keeping police on their toes. It was extraordinary when last year you had about 15 young Taiwanese who were walking on Zhongshan Xilu, and they pretend that they're Chinese tourists. And they have their little shopping bags, and they have that little flag and all that, and they walk by the Executive Yuan, and then they run. And they enter the compound at the Executive Yuan, sit on the ground, and then throw paint at the main gate and all that. And all the police are like, whoa, where did that come from? Right? And they were very original. They used deception, they used disinformation, they used social media extraordinarily well. And so I saw this organizing development within social movements that I said, okay, they're onto something here. It's mostly on Facebook in Taiwan rather than Twitter, as we saw in the Maghreb, for example, which means we have more bandwidth, we have more images, we have more videos. So now everybody is a responsible citizen reporter, if you will, and Facebook has become by far the best source of information for what's going on, which is exactly the reason why now the government has its own social media branches, because they seek to counter what's going on the internet. They were a bit late, but now they're catching on. They are appointing individuals who happen to be the husbands or wives of people who work for the Kuomintang. So it doesn't mean that they are necessarily the best qualified to do that. That gives me hope. It means that whatever attempt at propaganda that they initiate for the internet is not going to catch on with young people. They're far too intelligent for that. And it's a bit like, you know, governments fighting terrorist organizations. I mean, the government is always one generation behind, right? So and it's going to be the same thing in Taiwan. So I'm not scared at all by those efforts, except for these censorship efforts and preemption that we're starting to see. About a week ago, some people were called into a police station to give statements after they had posted an article that discussed doing these slow walks, protests at different intersections in Taipei. These individuals did absolutely nothing. They did not break the law, and yet they were taken to the police station. This is a form of intimidation. This is an attempt to censor individuals. So the nefarious effects of those efforts might be felt in that regard. But the propaganda war, our kids are a lot better. And they are supported by extremely qualified individuals, academics. Journalists, for the most part, have rallied behind social movements as well. They have gotten their own issues with police. Increasingly, we were being prevented from attending certain events or staying at one location, even though we flashed our press passes and all that, they would force us out. And then there's a backlash as well. The government increasingly sees the media as the enemy, but the media serves a very important function in democracy as well. So if the government does not want to play by the rules, well, we'll see what happens. But anyway, all that being said, I think this creates an amazing opportunity for discussion with members of society who otherwise might not have paid attention to Taiwanese politics. It creates a huge space for political parties and civil society to recruit individuals. And I think now is a great chance to, not only in elections, but just for everyday life, to reach out to the light blues, for example, and find common ground with them. And perhaps they can help apply pressure on KMT officials who run for office to pay greater attention to the demands of the public. And that's only beneficial for Taiwan, because the more you listen to the demands of the public, the less you will be able of giving certain things away to authoritarian China. So I think I've gone on for far too long as well. We won't have time for questions. So we will. Okay. So I can still talk for an hour. Thank you very much.